It took 121 seconds. A more than 30-year-long, almost spotless safety record erased within minutes as the Aerospaziale BAC Concorde crashed into a hotel just west of Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris. But what exactly happened? Air France flight 4590 was actually a charter flight. It was scheduled to fly from Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris, France, over towards JFK International in New York, United States. Once they landed in New York, the passengers, who were mainly German, but other nationalities as well, were supposed to get onto a cruise ship that would take them down to Ecuador in South America, making this probably a one-in-a-lifetime trip. There was 100 passengers scheduled for the flight and 6 cabin crew and 3 pilots. The aircraft being flown was the legendary Aerospaziale BAC Concorde, one of the most beautiful aircraft ever constructed and a feat of engineering. The Concorde first flew on the 2nd of March 1969, and during its more than 30-year tenure it had never suffered a fatal accident. At time 14, 42 and 30 seconds, the captain advances the 4 thrust levels in the cockpit towards takeoff thrust. This causes the 4 mighty Olympus engines to roar into full takeoff thrust with full reheat engaged, and the aircraft starts accelerating down the runway. 24 seconds later, the first officer calls out 100, which is then followed by the flight engineer saying 4 greens. This is indicating that each of the 4 go lights that is associated with each engine is showing that the engine is working normally and that the 4 reheats are engaged. 6 seconds later, the first officer calls out V1, and there's now no return from this takeoff. This is about 35 seconds into this flight. At time 14:43 and 9 seconds, a slight yaw to the left is noted on the flight data recorder. This yaw was not caused by any rudder movement, and at this point, when the aircraft passed about 1700 meters of the runway, they also found pieces of the water deflector from the left-hand main gear. So this probably represented the time when the Concorde rolled over that metal strip that was left behind by the DC-10 that had departed earlier. Within half a second, noise is recorded on the cockpit voice recorder, and that's likely coming from the explosion of one of the tires on the left main gear bogie. The reason that the investigators thought so was because at this point on the runway they could find the metal strip and also pieces of tire debris. 1 second later, the aircraft has accelerated to a speed of 178 knots, and at this point, that's about 1810 meters into the takeoff, a change of noise is heard in the cockpit. What has probably happened here is that pieces of the exploded tire have been thrown up towards the underside of the left-hand wing in the area of where fuel tank number 5 is situated. Now, those pieces have impacted the wing with such a force that it actually buckled the underside of the wing inwards, and the area around that buckle a little bit outwards, causing an enormous pressure wave inside of the tank. And since this tank was at this moment completely full, that pressure wave didn't have anywhere to go except pushing further on the area of the tank next to where this piece impacted, causing a rupture outwards of the fuel tank. And the reason that the investigators think that this is what happened is because they found pieces of the number 5 fuel tanks at this position on the runway, but the pieces indicated that the rupture had happened from inside of the fuel tank and not from the outside. The change of noise that can be heard on the voice recorder is most likely coming from the fact that several dozens liters of fuel is now gushing out through this hole from the number 5 fuel tank, and it has gotten into contact with something that caused it to ignite. Most likely, the tire, when it exploded, caused a breakage of some electrical wires in the left gear strut. Now, those broken wires then caused arcing that ignited the flame, and the fact that the landing gear was still extended meant that behind the landing gear there was a turbulence zone that allowed the flame to stabilize and maintain itself without being blown out by the airstream. What happens now is that the aircraft starts veering towards the left of the runway. The captain counteracts with right rudder to maintain descent line, and this is not because the engines are starting to fail, at least not at this point. Instead, it is likely that this veering moment is coming from the damage made to the left-hand tires, and also because of the aerodynamic drag that the flame is producing behind the aircraft. 2 seconds later, the aircraft is starting to lose thrust on both engine number 1 and 2, so both engines on the left-hand side. In the case of the number 1 engine, it's because it's ingesting a lot of debris from the broken tires, or rubber, things like that. And also quite a bit of hot gases. And in the case of engine number 2, which is the engine that's closest to the landing gear, it is because of ingestion of hot gases. As an engine ingests these gases, it changes the pressure inside of the compressor, and it can lead to compressor stalls, which is what's happening here. So the engine is basically choking on the gases. The first officer now calls out, "Watch out!" quickly followed by the flight engineer calling the exact same thing, "Watch out." And this is likely because the two go lights of engine 1 and 2 would have extinguished at this point, as they are stalling and not producing the thrust that they're supposed to do. The aircraft is now at a speed of 187 knots, still 8 knots below the rotation speed. But because both engine 1 and 2 have essentially failed at this point, engine number 1 is slowly recovering, but engine number 2 is back at idle thrust. The aircraft is starting to yaw very, very hard towards the left. The captain is counteracting this, but the aircraft is still starting to slightly veer off the center line. We don't know why the captain decides to start rotating at this point. Maybe it is because he feels that he's about to exit the runway. Maybe it is to avoid other traffic that he sees further down on the taxiway. We don't know this. But the fact is that he does start to rotate the aircraft, and he rotates slower than he would normally, probably indicating that he's aware that the speed is not high enough. As the aircraft is rotating, the flight engineer calls out something that sounds like "stop," but it wasn't clear on the voice recorder. But only a second later, he calls out "engine failure, engine number 2." And he's calling only engine failure on engine number 2 because engine number 1 is actually starting to recover from those initial stalls. But as the aircraft continues to rotate and the angle of the nose comes up higher and higher, the airflow changes around the wings, probably causing these hot gases once again to be ingested into both engine number 1 and engine number 2, probably using those secondary engine inlets that we talked about before. And this causes further stalls, which once again reduces the thrust back to near idle on both of these engines. At this point, the first engine fire alarm also can be heard in the cockpit, and the flight engineer responds to that with calling "shut down engine number 2," and the captain responds with "engine fire procedure." As this is happening, the air traffic controller can see this all happening out from his viewpoint in the control tower, and he calls out, "Air France 4590, you have flames trailing behind you." The first officer reads this back. The flight engineer is now doing the engine fire procedure, which means that he is reducing the thrust level back to idle on engine number 2, and he is also pulling and rotating the engine fire handle. This momentarily removes the fire alarm, as the extinguisher is likely cooling down the engine, but it's soon coming back again because of the fact that the fire is not actually in the engine, it's outside, and the engine fire circuit is just feeling the increase in temperature from the immense fire that is burning outside. While this is happening, and remember, everything that we've covered so far has only taken a few seconds, there's another radio call from an unknown aircraft somewhere on the airport. And the pilot there says on the radio, "It's really burning, eh?" And it's burning, and I'm not sure it's coming from the engine. The Concorde is now finally airborne, and just before it became airborne, it ran over a few edge lights on the left-hand side of the runway, and the crew now faces the next problem, which is their airspeed. Because they rotated at a slightly lower speed than they normally should have rotated with, they're now maintaining a speed of 200 knots, while their engine out climb speed is 220. This means that with that airspeed, they won't be able to climb or even maintain altitude. And the first officer points it out by calling speed several times. Engine number 1 is now recovering slightly, but it's heavily damaged and will never get back up to full thrust again. Engine number 2 has been shut down through the engine fire procedure that the flight engineer has just completed. And engine number 3 and 4 has gone into something called a contingency mode, which is where they are producing as much thrust as they possibly can in order to counteract the loss of thrust on 1 or 2 of the other engines. The Concorde is at an altitude of 100 feet radio with a speed of 200 knots and They're climbing with about 750 feet per minute. And at this point, air traffic control calls them and says, Air France 4590, you have large flames trailing behind you and you have priority to return back to the airfield. The first officer reads this back, and as he's done so, the flight engineer reminds him to take the gear up. Now, the first officer responds initially no to that, and that's likely because he knows that as a procedure, if there is an indication of a damage to the landing gear, the Concorde is not supposed to retract the gear. But then the captain breaks in and gives a direct order to retract the gear. The first officer tries, but it is evident from the cockpit voice recorder that he is unable to do so. He just cannot seem to get the gear up. The reason for this is likely because of the damage that has been caused by the tire explosion. It might have damaged the landing gear door on the left-hand side, and because of the sequence that the landing gear retraction is supposed to follow, if the landing gear door does not move when it's being commanded to do so, the landing gear will stay out. The captain now turns over to the flight engineer and asks him, are you shutting down engine number 2? And the flight engineer responds with, yes, it is shut down. The first officer again calls out airspeed, speed, and then the gear is not retracting. At time 14, 43 and 55 seconds, the first indications of an uncommanded roll can be seen on the flight data recorder. This roll likely is caused by the fact that the fire has now been burning for a while and it's starting to melt the inboard elevon on the left-hand side, which is causing flight control problems. Now, the captain is trying to counteract this roll, and meanwhile that is happening, the nose of the aircraft is pitching up more and more, and its angle of attack is constantly increasing. The first officer is listening out to the ATC frequency, and he can hear how Charles de Gaulle Tower is talking to the fire leader, who is telling the fire leader that the Concorde is likely going to return back for straight-in landing on the opposite runway. In response to that, he calls out Le Bourget, and we are going to try for Le Bourget. The engine fire alarm is now back again in the cockpit, and the engine number 1 is surging once again, removing all of the remaining thrust on that side of the aircraft. This further causes the aircraft to roll over to the left, and it gets into, at the worst point, a roll angle of 113 degrees to the left. The GPWS warning system is now sounding in the cockpit as well, saying poop, poop, pull up. Pull up, and as that is happening, there is indications that the thrust is being moved back on the remaining engines, 3 and 4. This is likely to try to counteract the roll and get the aircraft over to wings level in order to be able to get it to continue to fly. Unfortunately, it is just too late. Only seconds later, at time 14:44 and 31 seconds, the Concorde crashes into a hotel in Gonesse, just west of Charles de Gaulle Airport. As it does so, all 109 people on board the Concorde perishes, together with 4 people in the hotel on the ground. So in the end, the air accident investigation team concluded that a single burst tire, something that had happened to the Concorde before many times and was likely to potentially happen again, was the cause of this catastrophic and unreversible tragedy. And because of that conclusion, the airworthiness certificate of the Concorde was almost immediately withdrawn until some serious improvements could be done to the structure. All of this led to the Concorde being grounded for more than a year, and just before it was scheduled to get back into service, the horrible terrorist attacks of 9/11 happened in New York. That had a huge influence on the aviation business worldwide, so it was to become the beginning of the end of the Concorde era. The Concorde continued to fly for another approximately 2 years until British Airways, as the last remaining operator, retired the last Concorde on the 24th of October 2003, marking the end, at least for now, for passenger supersonic flight.